Yesterday, many Hezbollah agents or Hezbollah fighters are severely injured by the pegar attacks, which is once carried out by the Israeli Mossad or Israeli intelligence agency to the Lebanon's of where the Hezbollah is currently situated. Many Hezbollah fighters is severely injured. The reports calls that approximately 9 people are die and near about 3,000 people is killed. So this about what happens, what actually happens. So I have a beautiful clips. So let's see the clips.
I just want you to imagine what we would say if, let's just pick China or Iran. Let's pick China or Iran. One of the bad countries purposely knew that cell phones were coming to the United States. Let's say they knew they were coming to the U.S. military. The U.S. military was importing a bunch of devices, mobile devices, and the Chinese were able to intercept or collaborate with the manufacturer and put remote-controlled bombs inside each device, thousands of them. Which means you know they would not only be with generals and military officials, but with rank-and-file soldiers, but also just civilians who work near them, maybe their families, or anyone in their vicinity. If they're at a supermarket, which soldiers do go to, if they're at a shopping mall, they could injure and endanger anybody else around them. Obviously, what would we call that? We would call that terrorism. Nobody would actually be saying that that was some targeted attack. In fact, even when people do attack U.S. military installations and kill only American soldiers, we call that terrorism. There have been several during the War on Terror where people went and entered Marine bases and killed a dozen or so Marines, as well as other people who were there. That was called terrorism. The flying of a plane into the Pentagon, a classic legitimate military target, that was called terrorism. And obviously a lot of the October 7th attack, even though it was purposely distorted by trying to say, oh, 1,400 Israelis were killed, itself involved a lot of targeting of military and police bases by Hamas. A lot of those people, not 1,400, it's been downgraded to almost 1,150, almost half of them, if not more, turned out to be active duty soldiers in the military, the Israeli military. Now, obviously, there were a lot of civilians killed in Israel, not just killed, but targeted purposely. There were Hamas fighters who committed war crimes by purposely targeting and killing civilians, but the ratio of legitimate military targets to civilians was better than 1-to-1, which is often the argument that Israel makes for why what they're doing in Gaza is justified, even though that ratio is a lie. Now, just to underscore how we can think about this, after 9/11, Noam Chomsky wrote a book that surprisingly became a bestseller, or maybe not surprisingly, since he was one of the very few people deviating from the narrative about why 9/11 happened, what it means, what our role of our foreign policy is. And he has been talking a long time about how terrorism is wielded, how freedom fighter is wielded, how resistance fighters are wielded. We called the Mujahideen in Afghanistan freedom fighters. They were invited by Ronald Reagan to the White House to be celebrated while they were fighting against Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. And the minute they started fighting against American occupation, they instantly turned into terrorists. We took people from Afghanistan who were in Afghanistan, who were doing nothing more than defending their country and fighting against American forces occupying it, and brought them to Guantanamo and called them terrorists, even though they were targeting and fighting against not civilians, but American soldiers in their country. That's how manipulated and flexible and meaningless this term is, terrorism and the like. And here is, he did a series of interviews with a lot of very adversarial people who were horrified by the things he was saying, and it gave him an opportunity to really lay out the premises of what he was saying. This was now 22 years ago. And I know Noam Chomsky has said a lot of controversial things since then. People in public life for 60 years, there's almost nobody who will. So try and set aside whatever you think he's done or said that was bad, that's unrelated to this topic, and just listen to what he was saying in the beginning of 2002, just a few months after the 9/11 attack, when he among very few people were willing to say this, and the fact that he wrote a best-selling book made his platform among the largest.
But you seem to see this moral equivalence the whole
There's
time
no
between
moral-
bin Laden and Bush. don't you?
Moral equivalence is a term of propaganda that was invented to try to prevent us from looking at what the acts for which we are responsible.
You say there
I
are plenty of
reject
bin
that
Ladens on both sides.
Pardon?
You say there are plenty of bin Ladens,
Oh, there are bin Ladens all over the world.
on both sides.
There are plenty of
moral
monsters.
equivalence.
No, it's
That's
not.
a polemic,
It's
isn't it?
not moral equivalence. There is no such notion. There are many different dimensions and criteria. For example, there's no moral equivalence between the bombing of the World Trade Center and the destruction of Nicaragua, or of El Salvador, of Guatemala. The latter were far worse by any criterion. So there's no moral equivalence. Furthermore, they were done for different reasons, and they were done in different ways. There's all sorts of dimensions.
But
of
why,
difference.
when the U.S. is considering what to do about this, do you always go back to past
Not past,
crimes?
present.
To see, well,
Present.
you mentioned Nicaragua.
I mention that because it's uncontroversial, since there's a World Court and Security Council resolution. But I can take cases, since it's uncontroversial, that's a good example. I mention these cases.
Are you kicking the U.S. when it's down?
No, I'm asking that we accept the definition of hypocrite given in the Gospels. I think that's correct. The hypocrite is the person who refuses to apply to himself the standards he applies to others. I don't think we should be hypocrites.
To what aim do you do this? To what aim do you wish to point this at?
Because I think we should try to rise to the level of minimal moral integrity. Once we can rise to the level of minimal moral integrity, then we can discuss these issues seriously. If we can't even rise to that level, there's any point just talking. Minimal moral integrity requires that if we think something is wrong when they do it, it's wrong when we do it.
All right, so that is basically the premise of Chomsky's dissent from U.S. foreign policy for many decades. And if you just apply that to what happened today, you just imagine, as I said, China shipping in thousands of rigged phones with bombs that they then remotely detonate, regardless of where those phones are or who's carrying them. Or if Hezbollah or Iran did that inside Israel and killed and injured thousands of people, including civilians, and detonated those bombs in restaurants and shops, supermarkets, and street fairs, the way that Israel did today in the suburbs of Beirut, it's not very difficult to imagine exactly what everyone by consensus would call that. And the only thing different in these cases, in those actions, is who's doing it and against whom it's being perpetrated. And there's almost more of a reflexive instinct in the United States to defend anything and everything that Israel does as a noble act of terrorism or self-defense, almost more so than defending our own government itself. And I think that's a big part of why they want to implement a law banning a lot of different criticisms of Israel, including suggesting that there are Americans who seem to be more devoted to defending Israel than to their own government.